How long had I staggered for? Long enough for the sun to start bleeding through the dense foliage, it seemed. God, I was so tired. My eyes would barely open, leaving me almost blind as I clumsily made my way deeper into the Neverwood. I needed to sleep. But how could I? I was sure that if I stopped even for a moment, they would get me. But who was they? The police? Looking back, I saw no one. So who? The eye people? No, that wasn't right either. I would know if they were out here. At least, I hoped I would. No. It was something far less tangible. I reached out to steady myself on a nearby tree, but paused. The trees, I thought. Could it have been the trees? I shook my head. No, that was wrong. This isn't Narnia. No. I think it was the woods themselves. But I didn't get a chance to think on it. My body betrayed me and decided that we were going to sleep whether I wanted to or not. The last thing I remember, I was passing out with my face landing hard on a pillow of moss and twigs. I woke up in pain. My whole body ached. At first, all I could do was bring myself to let out a half-hearted groan. I spent that morning crying. I curled into a ball and just cried my heart out. I'm ashamed to admit it. I tried to keep it together for so long, but everything finally hit me. My whole life I had run away from my problems. I felt like all I ever did was let people down, and now I was even going to let Marshall down. Was he even still alive? It's funny how when you emotionally break down, the immediate shit isn't exactly what you think about. I mean, I was being hunted or something by mind-burning humanoid eye creatures, but yet all I could think about was how I let my friend down. And about all those kids in school that ignored me. I felt like I was losing myself. I cried the hardest when I thought of listening to the radio with Dad. It all hurt so much. 3 words kept circling my head. I ended up whispering, "I'm a loser." In the past, when I had said something like that, it hurt even more because there was this messed up feeling of acceptance that I got. Like, I was thinking, yes, Ash, you are a loser. The sooner you know it, the better. But not this time. I was angry at myself for even thinking it. Sure, things were bad. For Christ's sake, I was in a forbidden forest and was probably going to die of exposure. But for the first time, I decided that I shouldn't become my own target. Marshall was out there, and alive or dead, he needed to be found. No one else was going to do it, so I just had to accept it. I wasn't allowed to be a loser, I had to win. And that is a good thing. Like when someone you barely know gives you a compliment, though it was hard to accept. I had to win, I hissed. I had to accept that I was good enough if I was ever going to make it out of this place. I sat under that tree in that poorly lit forest, repeating that to myself for hours. I have to win. I rose to my feet and continued my search with a newfound determination. The Neverwood was deep. The trees towered over me, and what light came through was almost smoky in appearance. I hated every second of being in there. It was something deeply primal, the feeling of being watched, and that feeling would hang over me for the many days I spent aimlessly wandering through those woods. No matter how long I slept, my tiredness remained, and that was only exacerbated by the creeping hunger and thirst. I would have tried to find water and food, but I was not a hiker. I didn't know how to navigate the bush. So I stopped and listened, keeping an ear out for animals, streams, anything. I heard nothing. This far in, there was only silence. An inescapable, deathly silence. Hopelessness began to set in again. But on the morning of the 4th day, As I stopped to fantasize about a roast pork, I caught a glimpse of something shimmering in the dirt. A clue? Hell, did I care? It was something other than trees, leaves, and dirt. I almost sprinted towards it. It was a pink flip phone. Without going into too much detail, I'll just say that it had seen better days, so I obviously didn't expect it to work. But I held the on button anyway. To my surprise, it flashed to life. The screen was cracked and it only had 1% battery. Whatever I did, it had to be quick. After all, I wasn't exactly going to find a charger out here. I opened the gallery only to find picture after picture of what looked like the blurry inside of some poorly lit concrete building. In one of the images, I could have sworn I saw something, but as I got close to making it out, the phone died. Typical, I sighed. I turned the phone over in my hand, only to see the name. Jamie. Was she one of the kids that went missing in 2004? I was shocked, but not knowing what else to do, I put the phone in my pocket and kept searching. I knew I was looking for a building after what Damien had said, but it was proving hard to find. Had Jamie found the same building? I felt for the phone again. If Jamie was part of a group, that would make it safe to say that there'd be evidence of others around here. Her phone wouldn't just be out here by itself. Well, that's what I hoped. I found something better than phones and knickknacks, though. Nearby, tucked under a tree, was the unmistakable shape of a tent. I had found a campsite. I treaded softly as I got closer to the tents. It was safe to assume that the site had been abandoned, but there was no way of knowing for certain, and to be honest, I don't really want to add chainsaw-wielding psycho to my ever-growing list of shitty situations. There were 3 tents, 1 smaller and 2 larger multi-mans. I was surprised that they were still standing. Time had clearly taken its toll. In the dead of the Neverwood, frayed strips of fabric clung to the tent's barely standing skeleton and flapped weakly. Slowly, I unzipped the smallest of the 3. Inside, I was pleased to find it psycho-free, but it was still thick with a feeling of uneasiness. There was just something about seeing a pile of children's school bags sitting awkwardly in a puddle of green water that made my skin crawl. There was no denying it now. This was the camp of the Duskbowl children. The other tents offered much of the same. School bags, sunken air mattresses, the works. It was weird. For no real reason that I can explain, I felt like I was intruding. Every part of me was screaming that it was wrong to be there. It was unnatural. I gave in to that feeling. There was no sense in staying there anyway. I had what I needed. I collected up as many of the school bags that I could carry and left the campsite. It felt like I'd been walking for half an hour. I don't know. The passage of time was getting harder and harder to measure. Was that thanks to the Neverwood or my ever-worsening state? My stomach growled and the inside of my mouth felt like rubber. Not to mention the hateful headache that I just couldn't shake. I thought of how cavemen used to use a sharp rock to carve a small hole in the skull to relieve headaches. Someone had told me that long ago, that was to release pressure inside the skull. At least, that was the idea. The thought of it had a weird sort of temptation to it. Was it curiosity? What if I just picked up a rock and made a small hole in my skull? Maybe where the bone was softest, the temples maybe. Perhaps that would make me feel better. I shook the idea from my head. What was I thinking? Massaging my temples, I slumped down at the base of a tree. I think these headaches are getting worse, I said. To no one, reasoning that it was probably dehydration. Or maybe I'm just going quietly insane here. It was meant as a joke, but my chuckle trailed off into uncertainty. An itch cut through my brooding. I followed the feeling to the back of my hand, where I saw a little red bump. I opened both my palms and looked up as if to say, "Are you kidding me?" "Mosquitoes," I sighed. "Awesome." I absent-mindedly scratched at the bite as I looked back to the school bags that lay in a heap next to me. Well, now's a good time as any. I opened each of the bags and spilled out their contents into a little pile. It wasn't what you'd expect, just your typical camping luggage. But as I sorted through the smattering of loose clothes, I found a few things of note. There was a diary, a half-empty bottle of water, and, as if to mock me, a rotten apple. The closest thing I'd seen to food in days, and it was rotten. Because of course it was. I held up the bottle. Does water go off? I mean, it didn't look green or anything, but it had been out here for a while. Fuck it. I ripped open the lid and sculled its contents, doing my best not to think about it, but in any other circumstance, it would have been heaven. Feeling the cool liquid wash over the dry and rubbery flesh of my throat was the closest thing I'd had to comfort in days. That would stave off dying of thirst for a while, but I was still overtired and hungry. Oh well, 1 out of 3 ain't bad. Finally, the diary. There had to be something in there. Thumbing through the pages, I learned that it belonged to a girl named Christy. I wonder if she was friends with Jamie. The diary was bloated with so many scribblings. A lot of it was useless in my search for Companist, but in the bowels of the Neverwood, it made me smile to at least have the whisper of another person. Christy was a sassy girl. Going by her writing, not popular by any stretch, but clearly well thought of in her group of friends. She loved shopping, sleepovers, and makeup. We weren't exactly kindred spirits. It turned out that most of the diary was long gone. Page after page had been torn out. I guess I'd never know what happened to Christy. Or would I? In the back of the diary, Christy had left several sheets of paper folded and tacked to the hard cover. Unfolding them revealed several similar crudely drawn maps. Maps. Were they trying to map out the Neverwood? Each of them were labeled as Route 1, Route 2, etc. Routes 1 through 5 had a cross through them. Discarded failures, it seemed. Only Route 6 had a small tick in the top right corner. My nose began to bleed a little, probably from dehydration. I wiped it away, my attention still glued to the maps. For the first time in days, I felt like I was close to something. The maps were hard to make out, sure, but once I began to understand them, they made some sense of the labyrinth of trees that I didn't want to admit I was lost in. Each map used their campsite as a reference point, and each had a series of directions leading to a break in the trees, where Christy had drawn a large rectangle and written the words, "The Composer," inside it. The Composer. There's that term again. What was that? Every map led to it, but none led to an exit to the Neverwood. Knowing that Christy, Jamie, and their friends were never seen again, that hit me with a wave of quiet sadness. All I had to do now was find the campsite. I muttered as my gaze drifted to the image of tents ahead of me. Hadn't I walked away from here? Had I gone in a circle? No, that can't be right. I walked in a straight line. I was sure I did, and yet 30 paces in front of me were the weathered tents of the Duskbowl children. I had never found convenience more disturbing in all my life. But with little left to do, I rose and followed Route 6 to the composer. The walk was long and hard. My head still burned and my mosquito bite still demanded itching. But I took some peace of mind with the map in my hand. It made some sense out of this unnatural place. The walk took me a day and a half, and by the time I saw the clearing ahead of me, I was barely shambling from exhaustion. But as I got closer, my eyes fell away from it and instead onto the ground before it. There was an object, something square and shiny. I recognized it instantly. Carefully, I knelt and picked it up. Marshall's tape recorder had been left out here. Had he left it, or was it dropped? Jamie's phone made me uncomfortable, but this left me afraid. Again, that horrible thought whispered, "Am I too late?" I opened the machine, hoping to see a tape of his that I could at least play. Then maybe I could get an idea of what happened. It was empty. Disappointment fell over me. I held the recorder tighter. I don't know why. I guess it made me feel closer to finding him somehow. I stood and walked into the clearing. And there stood an old, vast brick building. It was a relief to see something human, but it held no reassurance. It felt just as threatening as the Neverwood had. I looked to the brass nameplate that barely hung over the entrance. It was worn in more ways than one and covered in overgrowth, but even still, I made out the words. Companist Psychiatric Hospital.
(1987). The coffin sat silently at the end of the room, waiting for him.
Please, I can't do this,
Scott thought as he tried to keep his eyes from the pine box's open lid. He focused on his feet instead. Ignorance is bliss. Those words had circled his head throughout the last year, and the whole way through the funeral process. He wished they could apply to him. He wished he didn't have to watch her wither, see her eyes shut, and now, in this cold hall, stare at her painted corpse. But as his son, Joey, stood awkwardly next to him, hands sliding in and out and into his pockets, Scott knew that not knowing was a privilege he could not afford.
How do I stand again? Should I have my hands in my pockets? Should I look like I have my shit together? Or would it look bad if I did? Fuck. How the hell do people do this?
All these thoughts and more whirled around Scott's head.
Damn it.
These muttered words were the first he had said aloud as he felt his eyes burn again, the warning sign of tears.
Be strong for them. Come on, you can do this.
He sucked in his sadness. No tears today. He placed a hand on Joey's shoulder.
You don't have to do this if you don't want to,
he said. Joey was almost a man now. A lanky beanpole of a man, but grown nonetheless. He was wearing the cheap, poorly fitting suit he had bought for his high school formal. That made Scott cringe, but Joey insisted. Scott was more than happy to pay for a rental, but his son had made a point of doing everything off his own back nowadays. And you know what? Scott couldn't have been prouder. Joey said with an almost smile and a poorly hidden crack in his voice.
It's okay, Dad. I can do this. For Mom.
All right.
Scott mustered his courage.
As soon as you're ready, we'll see her.
Joey wiped his eyes with his wrist.
Thanks, Dad.
He could play I'm a grown-up, I swear, as much as he liked, but Scott would lay down on the freeway before letting him go up there alone. But it was just Eve, right? There was no monster waiting in the small pine box. There was just funny, understanding Eve, the queen of sarcasm. Scott tensed. No, he couldn't think that. Otherwise, he'd have to admit she was.
Gone, Scott. Gone.
He continued arguing with the voices in his head.
Admit it to yourself so we can move on. Please, for fuck's sake. She's gone, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Dad?
Joey saw him pause. Scream the hurt away. That's all Scott wanted to do. Weep until he couldn't. All the pain bubbling up inside him, he just wanted it out. But he couldn't. That's what he had told himself. He had to be their rock, be strong for them, as if seeing their father cry would make it worse for them somehow. That was it. He'd let them scream into his chest, pour out their hearts. All the while, he'd hold them and tell them it was all going to be okay. But who would do that for him? No one. Because of one simple truth. Daddies aren't supposed to cry. Scott smiled reassuringly.
Just waiting on you. Whenever you're ready.
Joey exhaled his fear and found his resolve.
Okay, let's do this.
The two men started down the long, empty aisle to Eve's coffin. Every fiber of Scott's being was screaming, begging his legs to turn and run. But the dutiful father gritted his teeth and kept in pace with his son. With every step, his chest tightened, and flashes of Eve played in his mind. He wanted so badly to have her hold his head and tell him that she would be home soon.
No tears.
He whispered. Then, sooner than he expected, there they were, standing over the pine box. Scott stared at the ceiling, still unable to look inside. But next to him, Joey's body had stiffened, and the young man was transfixed by the visage of his dead mother. He was always a mommy's boy. Scott lost his wife, but Joey lost his mother. He couldn't begin to understand how hard this was for him. It is an unspoken truth that every child has a favorite parent. Joey was no different. Eve gave that little boy all her love and all her soul. Scott feared her passing would take a piece of Joey with her. A certain softness would be erased from his being, and the world would grow just a bit colder in Scott's eyes. As Joey's scream cried and retreated to his father's chest, Scott knew in his bones that he had hated himself for this, that which was in no way his fault. No use in fear now. Showtime. Scott breathed deep and looked to the face of his wife.
Eve.
They said she would be better, that they would make it look like she was sleeping. But as Scott stared, his stomach twisted into knots. He knew she wasn't. Everyone had said that if he didn't see her one last time, it would weigh on him for the rest of his life. That if he did see her, it would bring the closure he would need to be whole again. But she didn't look like she was sleeping. It looked like her. Her fair skin and her frizzy hair were so delicately placed, but it was like a model of a person. All Scott could see as he stared was an empty house, a fireplace without a flame. It was like a spot reserved for her that she didn't fill. It was a promise that she was gone, and she was never coming back. Scott's face twitched as he tried harder than ever to swallow his sorrow. He tore his eyes from the body and across the vast stretch of empty seats. And there, 2 rows from the back, he saw her, the little girl quietly crossing and uncrossing her feet, too young to understand, and patiently waiting to be told it was her turn. It was in that moment that Scott Campbell made a decision that started his daughter down a path he'd never foresee. But he was fallible, and had only tried, as all parents do, to do what was best for his child.
She won't see,
he said. Joey looked up at him, tears streaming down his face and confusion in his voice.
What?
Scott looked into his son's weeping eyes and was reassured of his choice.
I won't have her see her like this. I just won't.
Why?
Scott turned back to his daughter, little Ashley Campbell, and her innocent eyes.
Ignorance is bliss.
2. Being a parent is fucking hard. There's really no other way to say it. You try to guide and mentor, but oftentimes you'll end up yelling and arguing. It comes from a place of love. Of that, you're certain. But whether or not your kids see that is a different story. A wise man once said, if your children don't hate you, you were never their parent. But as little Ashley Campbell, now 12, sat alone in front of her brother's TV, trying hard to ignore the screaming match in the other room, the idea of hating her dad was the farthest thing from her mind.
She doesn't care about her.
Joey always screamed the loudest. His voice got shrill whenever he made reference to his mom. Joey always screamed the loudest. His voice got shrill whenever he made reference to his mom. It was hard for him. Ash knew that. And Scott knew that too. Emotions are like a liquid, a thick tar-like substance that pours into you. They need to be confronted, resolved. Otherwise, you'll bloat and burst, and then the tar will eat away at your very being.
Of course she cares. She just expresses it differently.
Scott was trying hard to keep his voice low and stern.
You really think so? She never talks about her, never comes to visit. I don't even think she knows what she looks like.
Joey.
I hate her.
Joey.
Scott barked. Ash covered her ears and shut her eyes tightly. Just don't think about it. Just don't think about it, she said. Was there something wrong with her? Ash hated pain. She didn't know what to do with it. Grief, sorrow, just big words for those feelings that made her eyes water and her insides cold. Big words for big feelings. Too big for little Ash. So, she ran from them, buried them, built a strong box in her head and discarded them there. Down what tears she might have cried. Ash composed herself. Looking to Joey's video shelf, she picked Die Hard and slid it into the VCR.
You coddle her. She's a freak because...
Was the last thing she heard before she turned up the movie's volume. Run from it, she thought. A clock on the wall rattled as Ash heard the dulled sound of the front door slamming. The TV said as John McLean found himself trapped in a vent. The door behind her opened, but she didn't turn to see who was there. Scott wheezed as he began the Herculean task of getting down with his newly brittle bones. He wrapped an arm around her. Father and daughter sitting together on the floor. The only light was that of the TV.
What are we watching?
Ash looked at the video's case again. Die Hard, she said. Ash nestled into Scott's lap as Hans Gruber struggled to track down his American cowboy.
You know, I saw this at the pictures.
Scott said. Ash grunted a response, and her dad let out a long, tired breath.
Chatterbox, I'm sorry you had to hear that. He doesn't mean it, I swear. He's just...
Scott rubbed her back.
Going through some things.
Ash said nothing, pretending as though the subject wasn't brought up. Scott looked around the room. Figurines, video games, movies, and posters. He cocked his head as he thought that Joey really was a pop culture fanatic. This was a guy who could quote Star Trek backwards and give you a detailed history of Eternia. And there was Ash, surrounding herself with it all. Because Joey likes it, was the answer she gave when Scott asked her why specifically Die Hard was chosen. And that was the answer to so many things. Why are you wearing that hoodie? Why are you playing that game? Why are you reading that book? Every time the answer was the same. Because Joey likes it. Ash was one of those kids that played follow the leader. You know the ones. A kid who picks someone in their life and decides from that day on that that's who they want to be. For as long as anyone could remember, Ash dressed like her brother, spoke like her brother, and followed him wherever he went. But whilst Ash looked up to her idol, He looked back and saw only a shadow. And then there was Scott, scared to his core that he had failed as a parent, scared that Ash would grow up as one of those codependent sorts, someone who lives their life entirely by the metric of what others want.
Chatterbox?
Scott called her by the nickname born from his daughter's relative quiet disposition.
Sometimes in life, people aren't going to like you.
Why? Is there something wrong with me? Ash said after a brief pause.
No, and there never will be.
He turned her to face him.
Do you hear me? There never will be.
Ash looked back at the TV. Then why?
Well, people are complicated. We're all different, all have different hopes and beliefs. You can't please everyone, Chatterbox. The world just doesn't work like that.
Ash hugged his knee. So what am I supposed to do? No matter how hard I try, no one ever... She trailed off. Scott couldn't imagine what it was like. He gave his baby girl all the time in the world. Hell, if she asked him for the moon, just like in that old movie, he'd tie a lasso around it and pull it down for her. That, after all, is what a dad is. The man that'd permanently fuck up the planet's tides just to see his daughter smile. But he couldn't control other people. And other people, Ash, seemed to be the problem. Every day she'd shuffle in the door, back from another long, lonely day of school. Scott would get this bittersweet feeling when she'd show off all the drawings she'd made at school when she got home. He'd smile because it was one of the few things she did, only for her. But he'd wince because it meant, again, all her spare time was spent alone in the school library.
12 years old,
he thought, and still no friends to speak of. Well, except for one. I wish you were a kid, Ash said lowly. Scott had some difficulty readjusting, but he bent down and kissed her head.
Hey, are you saying I'm not? For God's sake, woman, I'm barely into my double digits.
He whispered with a smile.
By Jove, the lady doth offend me so.
Like music to Scott's ears, Ash giggled. You're a dork, she said.
Right back at you, Chatterbox.
He held her close, hoping that whatever happened down the road, Ash would never put herself down, never think low of herself, and know that, no matter what, he'd always love her.
Right back at you.
3. Radio. It all came down to radio. Becoming an announcer for Sampsonshire's biggest station was something Joey had worked most of his adult life to achieve. Sampsonshire was a big place, and with so many stations all competing for the eardrums of the masses, you had to be cut from a different cloth to survive in the industry. With his gift of the gab, success had come to Joey like water from a tap. When he was on the air, he could have you hanging on his every word, get you pumped for any song, even the top 40 ones, and, on occasion, sprinkle in an endorsement for whatever 2-bit product the higher-ups wanted to sell. But what was he? Really? A painted whore was what he thought. On the air, he'd urge you to trust him, whilst he spewed out whatever script or ad read the bosses wanted him to, justifying it to himself. He thought that at least they paid him for the privilege. His reputation, his nice house, the string of no-name dames and booty shorts. It all came down to radio. It was the winter of 2002, and Joey stood quiet as death as his father explained the doctor's verdict. The condition. It was explained in only a sentence or two. What expectancy could be drawn from this new unseen thing? Then, silence. The two men stood awkwardly, both trying to rationalize the fallout, and both dimly aware of the similarities between this and what happened to Eve. Joey might have held his father's hand, might have said, "I love you." He might have done a lot of things differently, if not for the next words out of Scott's mouth.
You can't tell your sister.
He said. Joey felt like someone had pressed a gun against his chest and pulled the trigger. His lips twitched as vicious words barely formed. He balled his fists and stormed into the kitchen, determined to find Ash, to shatter the world of bubble wrap he believed their father wrapped her in. And then he saw it. On the dining table, where there should have been flowers and a fruit bowl, was a small AM radio and a pair of unplugged headphones, and a hairbrush made to look like a microphone. Ash turned into the room, Game Boy in hand, and beamed when she saw her brother.
Joey, hey, it's so good to see you. I heard you on air the other day, and...
Joey turned back to Scott and said with a quiet anger,
What is all this?
He pointed to the dining table. Ash jumped in instead.
It's awesome you're here. Maybe you can give me some tips. I'm going to start at the community station in a few weeks, and Dad's helping me practice talking with confidence and stuff. You know, by pretending we're on air. It was Dad's idea, actually. He's real smart, so basically, we wait for the announcer to start talking, and then we turn him down, and...
Joey glared at his father.
Am I a fucking joke to you?
She just wants to go into radio. It's something she's really passionate about. It has nothing to do with you.
It has everything to do with me. She's a stunted child who never learned to grow a personality because you fucking coddle her.
That's not true!
Ash said. And both men did a double take as meek little Ashley spoke louder than a squeak for once. Joey's face darkened, and for once, he acknowledged his sister.
You're not coddled.
I'm not.
He bore down on her, his face inches from hers.
You're not?
He said in a mocking voice.
Joey!
Scott barked. Joey snatched the Game Boy from Ash's hands and tossed it across the room, sending it smashing to the floor.
Those things are for little kids. Grow the hell up.
Scott stormed towards him, but Joey pushed him back.
I'm not done.
He snatched a photo of his mother and pushed it into Ash's face. Ash began to cry and turned her face from the picture. Joey forced her face back and screamed.
Look at her!
I can't!
Joey was in her face now. Spittle flew from his mouth and his eyes were wide.
Her name was Eve Campbell. She was a Pisces. Her favorite movie was As Time Goes By. She made pancakes on the weekends. She taught me to ride a bike, play rock, paper, scissors, and...
Ash covered her face and fell in a puddle to the floor. In a fit of rage, Joey hurled the photo across the room and yelled again.
Fucking look at her!
Quiet crept into the disaster zone, and Joey stood limp, drunk with emotion. Scott struggled to his feet and shakily picked up the shattered pieces of Eve's photo. Even now, he refused to cry, still certain he did it for them. He staggered over to his son, who, now, began to realize what he had done.
Dad, I'm...
Scott said evenly and meticulously.
Get out.
Dad,
Now.
Joey left without another word, and Scott helped Ash up onto the couch, where he held her as she cried. 4. The night of the accident was a regular one. That's the way of it, I guess. Life doesn't really ever give you that Hollywood moment. Things just happen. It had been a month or so since the incident with Joey, and it was finally time for Ash to have her first broadcast at the community station.
It's all taken care of,
she had said.
I really think they're going to like me.
Scott pulled out all the stops. He had made a slow roast for dinner, and now, as Ash got changed into her idea of business casual, he washed the dishes for dinner. It had been a long road to get here. At first, Ash wasn't even sure she wanted to pursue this. Her dream.
You'll just think I'm copying Joey again,
she said. Scott had to kick himself then, and still did, forever discrediting what she wanted to do with her life. Sure, her brother was in the industry, but that didn't mean she was forbidden from being interested in it. Joey wasn't the center of the universe.
How do I look?
Ash said as she clopped out in heels that she barely wore, looking like an early 2000s remix of Grace Kelly.
You look...
He paused as he saw her eye her trusty blue hoodie draped over the couch. Scott clicked his fingers, snapping her eyes back to him.
Over here, Chatterbox. Yes, hello. Fine. You look fine.
She flushed with embarrassment.
You don't think it's too much?
Scott laughed. She was a jittery, nervous one. It had taken weeks to get a whisper of confidence out of Ash in preparation for tonight. Many hours at their mock-up radio station practicing speech.
Just act natural.
He had told her.
Okay, great. But what does that even mean?
She asked back. Scott put the last dish to drip dry on the rack and swooped over to the couch and grabbed her hoodie.
All right, I've got it. I'll put it in the car, and you can toss it on when you get out there tonight.
Ash smiled.
Thanks, Dad.
Sampsonshire was just like any other metropolitan area. Loud cars, louder trains, and dead quiet people. As Ash leaned her head against the passenger side window on the drive up to the station, Scott wondered what must have been going through her head. But more so, if and when he should tell her about the condition. Let your family know and get all of your affairs in order, the doctor had said in a detached, clinical way. Scott shook it from his head. Not yet. He knew she had seen him cough, seen him sway and prop himself up on railings and countertops. But Ash, sweet Ash, as always, turned a blind eye to what she saw. All this time, and her way of coping was still to run away. He hoped he had done right by her. That's all he had tried to do, all he had ever tried to do. And as she sat beside him, now less than an hour from starting the next chapter of her life, Scott knew in his bones, no matter what happened, he was so damn proud of her. When they pulled up to the station, they were met with a shabby building, flanked on both sides by overgrowth. Scott grunted. If they had faces for radio, why shouldn't their workplace?
Hey, Dad.
Ash said.
Yeah, what's up?
Can I borrow your phone?
Was it weird that Ash didn't have her own phone yet? Maybe. Yes, she was an adult, but she was still living at home and had no friends to ring anyway. He handed it over. She thanked him and climbed out of the car, walking a few paces away before he could see her start speaking. Now, in this, one of his briefest moments of solitude, Scott thought about letting just a tiny bit of his sadness out. Decades of pain now that he had buried and avoided. Don't cry. Never cry. For them. So he didn't. But he looked out the windscreen, over the roof of the station, and into the black gulf of the sky.
Did I do good, Eve? Did I do good?
Ash came back to the car and handed Scott his phone.
Here you go,
she said, a somber tone to her voice.
Thanks, Chatterbox. Is everything all good?
Yeah, it's fine. But hey, I gotta go in soon.
She crossed both her fingers and gave that nervous whisper yell of excitement.
Wish me luck,
Scott said in that reassuring way.
Honey, you'll be fantastic.
She smiled and disappeared into the station. Scott tuned to its respective frequency and waited. He reasoned that the Golden Oldies Country Power Hour was worth sitting through if his daughter was on after it. The minutes flew into an hour, and still, Ash wasn't on the air. He went to check his watch, but then it happened. Scott's phone chirped with an incoming call. He dug into his pocket and fished it out.
Scott Campbell speaking.
Mr. Campbell?
Came the voice on the other end.
Speaking.
There was a staticky silence as the man on the other end tried his best to talk about something he wasn't prepared for.
Mr. Campbell, it's your son. I'm sorry to be the one to have to tell you this, but there's been an accident. Are you able to come by the hospital?
Scott looked to the station, and then to the phone. His heart was jumping in his chest.
Yes, of course. Which one?
Scott hurried into the station and found Ash. She was sitting just outside the booth, idiot grin on her face and mere minutes from going on. That was the last time he saw her smile like that. They sat in the car outside the hospital, both knowing what was inside, but neither ready to face it. Scott felt the weight of everything on him.
First Eve, now Joey.
He thought. Life was a cruel, cruel bitch to the Campbell family.
Okay, you ready to go in?
His voice cracked as he said it. Ash said nothing. Then he heard it. Under her breath, almost like a prayer, she muttered, "Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think about it." Covering her hands over her ears. He felt something twinge inside. But he wasn't his son. Scott just squeezed her shoulder and said,
Chatterbox, it's okay, sweetie. You don't have to see him.
Scott felt numb, icy, as he got out of the car and went to the morgue, alone. 5. Reaping the seeds you sow. Scott always wondered if it was his fault. Not what happened to Eve, not what happened to Joey, but rather, Ash. She never saw him at the morgue, and Scott told her it was all right. She never saw him at the wake, and Scott told her it was all right. And finally, she couldn't bring herself to see him into the ground. And Scott, well, had trouble with that. With each day that passed, his joints got stiffer, and his bones more brittle. The dizzy spells were just a daily occurrence now. But all Scott could think about were two things. Could he bring himself to tell her? And would she leave him without a goodbye? Just like Joey. It wasn't fair on her to think that. But as mortality dawned on him, Scott Campbell wanted more than air. To finally open his heart and talk to someone, let all his pain go flooding out. He didn't cry for Eve for the sake of the kids, and he didn't cry for Joey for the sake of Ash. But now, those emotions, that tar, was drowning him. They were sat at the dinner table, shyly poking at supermarket chicken with their forks, saying nothing. Only the most recent of dinners like this since what happened to Joey. Car accident, that's what they called it. A freak tragedy of bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, they said. I'm so sorry for your loss, they said. It was some other driver. They turned a corner too fast, and then, bang, that was it. Lights out for Joseph Campbell. Just like that. If life had taught Scott anything, it was that. Despite what you think is a kid, human beings are extraordinarily fragile. Anyone, for any reason, could drop at any second. It's my fault, Ash squeaked. Scott looked up from his chicken.
What are you talking about, sweetie? Of course it wasn't.
I called him.
She said, not crying, rather staring in awe at her perceived crime.
I took your phone, and I asked to come and see me after the broadcast, that I was sorry for the way that I am, and that I just wanted him to be happy.
She looked up at Scott, who had to look away so as not to break his tears rule.
I just wanted him to be proud of me, Daddy. I just wanted him to love me.
Scott, the father who was always full of advice and guidance, couldn't find any words.
Wouldn't have been driving if it wasn't for me.
She looked back down at her plate.
Wouldn't have been driving.
Scott stood and left to his room without saying a word. Ash left the table too and shuffled to Joey's old room. She dusted off his many nerdy bits and pieces, all the things he had abandoned in the pursuit of being a grown-up, until finally she got to his movie shelf. She slid Die Hard into the VCR, put her hands over her ears,
Don't think about it.
and began chanting
Don't
again
think about it. Don't think about it.
as tears ran down her face.
Don't
But
think
life
about
wasn't finished with the Campbells. Next came the long sleep. Scott didn't leave his room the following morning. Ash thought that was fair, as she had labeled herself as her brother's murderer. But then came the next morning, and the next. When she opened his bedroom door to see he had not touched the food and water she had left him at the threshold, she panicked and made the call. Hyperventilating and clawing at his unconscious body, she wailed into the phone,
Please come help! My daddy, he won't get up!
When they got to the hospital, and Scott was wheeled away by a team of men in white smocks, another man, a doctor, her dad's doctor, sat her down and asked,
So I take it you know what this means?
She didn't, and he explained. It was a wall of white noise. It's strange how everything becomes out of focus when tragedy hits. Tragedy, something Ash was all too familiar with now, but entirely unequipped to deal with. Words like terminal and days floated into her ears. The doctor grabbed her hand.
But you will wake before then, my dear, I promise.
Shrill beeping and a cold, blinding light were what Scott woke to. He was scared. He felt weak. He felt like a little kid who forgot where they fell asleep and awoke in fear. But as the shrill beeping matched his own terror, and as he felt the cold air through his thin gown, he knew where he was. He was going to die. Jesus, fuck, he was going to die. It was all so real to him now. His eyes darted about frantically until they finally settled on the figure sitting next to him.
Chatterbox.
A wave of relief hit him as he reached out a hand to his baby girl. But an unfamiliar voice came back.
It's all right, sir. You're in the hospital.
A nurse. Just a nurse. He tried to sit up, weak against the cables. He looked around the room for his little chatterbox, his one life raft in the storm. He wanted to tell her so much, but mostly he just wanted to be held. But he was alone. Everything bore down on him. Reality and understanding. The cold, uncaring truth. Scott sank defeated back into the bed, all his pain bubbling inside. Eve had left him. Joey had left him. And now, even his sweet, dorky ray of sunshine, his chatterbox had left him too. He was alone.
Ash?
Came a whimper. Then finally, voice cracking, Scott Campbell cried. On the long-distance bus carrying far away to God knows where, Ash was crying too. Her thigh was bruised from how many times she had punched it. I made a mistake, she said, but she couldn't turn back. Samson Shire held nothing for her but sadness, an ocean of it. So even though it made her loathe her very being, Ash ran away, because that was all she knew how to do. Whether it was her mother's face, her brother's body, or her father's deathbed, Ash could only turn away, because ignorance is bliss.
Company stood before me. Long grass twisted around it, and much of its old brick was overgrown and cracked. Through its empty doorway was an endless pool of black. It was like the gaping mouth of a monster. I held Marshall's recorder tighter and walked in. Have you ever been in an abandoned building? Well, they trigger something that I can only describe as primal in you. It's a sort of hyper-alertness. You breathe softly and you take light steps, making sure to keep an ear out for anything that could be considered a threat. Companist was no different. Its long, empty halls echoed with every step, and I found my eyes darting about, keeping me ready to run. I walked past several nurses' stations. Psychiatric hospital. The words circled my head. What happened here? Why was a hospital so far out here? Dated computers sat alongside dust-caked books on the desks. I opened one. It held records mostly, full of patient names and their corresponding room numbers. Interesting stuff, to say the least, but useless to me. Rubbing my eyes, I cursed the dark. It was so hard to see. I wished for a torch, but of course I didn't have one. I couldn't stop thinking of just how unprepared I was for this. I was amazed that I hadn't died of exposure in the Neverwood, and the thought of starving to death still hung over me. Well, I couldn't exactly go supply shopping in between running from the cops and entering a forbidden forest. I feebly tried to justify it to myself. I would have sold my soul for food and water at that moment. I scratched at my mosquito bite. I felt it and, puzzled, looked at it. Yet again, it felt bigger. I know scratching makes it worse, but this was excessive. I sniffed it, and sure enough, it punged. An infection, I reasoned, as if my day couldn't get any worse. I hoped that this place had a locked supply closet of paracetamol hidden away somewhere. Do drugs have an expiry date? I hoped not. My headache was still throbbing, and if I couldn't eat or drink, at the very least, I'd want some Panadol. After a while, I lost sight of the way I had come. It was like the deep black had swallowed it up. I wanted to run back and find it, but I knew that answers were somewhere in here. And they were close, so I ran my hand along a nearby wall and let it guide me. Deeper. Every so often I'd accidentally kick an old syringe or stumble over some debris. I'd freeze every time. Could something have heard that? Is it going to know where I am? I thought, every time. My heart would drum in my ears as I quietly panicked, but every time, nothing happened. Many of the halls were empty, same for row after row of doors lining the walls. They had names printed on them. They were hard to make out in the dark, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. Caroline Noon, Madeline Brooke, and Derek Pierce were all examples. I tried to think. What was familiar about them? I didn't know anyone with those names. Did I? I rubbed my temples and shrugged. It was a mystery for later. I can't tell you how long I wandered those halls. And I didn't even want to think about how lost I really was. Even if I found Marshall, how would I get him out of here? I shook my head. That was a problem I couldn't afford to think about. I needed every last drop of morale I could muster. Suddenly, cutting through the dead silence, there was a gut-wrenching screaming sound, a sound like a feral animal caught in a trap. It was so loud I had to cover my ears, and it shocked me enough that I fell backwards. My body went numb with adrenaline as I heard the sound of feet shortly after. The slapping sound of bare feet on concrete filled the air, and it was getting closer. I froze, hoping that if I was still and quiet enough, the dark would hide me. I was like a kid hiding under their blankets. At the end of the hall, a shape turned the corner, falling over as it did. It threw itself to its feet and sprinted down the hall towards me, and I don't mean ran, I mean sprinted. My mind was buzzing with ideas to run or to hide or to stay frozen. My heart punched my ribcage as the shape got closer and closer. It was fast. It was only a few feet away from me when my logic finally kicked in. I stood to run, but as I did, the shape slammed into me with enough force to send us both sliding and to leave me winded. The shape screamed and leapt off me. It scrambled to the far wall and panted heavily. It was a woman.
Are you a person?
She shrieked, sounding to be in disbelief. I struggled to speak as I gasped for air.
Are you a person?
She repeated, She was clearly desperate. Yes, was all I could croak. She panted, but eventually let out.
Oh, thank God.
The scream from before rang through the halls again, and without another second, the woman grabbed my wrist, dragged me to my feet, and ran, pulling my dazed body behind her. Wait, I was trying to protest.
There's no time. We have to get out of here.
I broke free and fell against the wall. The woman stared at me, shifting in place, clearly deciding whether or not to keep running. She knelt in front of me.
Listen to me, okay? We have to get out of here right now.
I'm looking for someone. I can't. A sadness came over the woman's gaunt face.
You shouldn't have come in here.
She said softly. Marshall. I said his name more for me than anything.
Marshall?
There was a clear recognition in the woman's voice. I straightened myself and caught my breath. You know him. The woman said nothing, but looked back the way she came. I followed her eyes, and a pit grew in my chest. I have to find Marshall. The woman stared longingly at the way I had come, then sighed and nodded. I don't know what she understood, but there was an air of understanding. She took my hands and pulled me to my feet.
My name's Ellen.
Ash, I said. Can you take me to Marshall? Ellen? Ellen was clearly terrified, but that sadness still clung to her. What was that? Ellen said nothing but took me down the way she'd came. She didn't use the wall as a guide. I don't even think she was really paying attention. This was clearly a route she had walked many times. Her hair was long and knotted. She was clearly malnourished. She wore a yellowing, tattered white smock-like thing that sort of resembled a patient gown. Had some sicko forced her into that disgusting thing? Are you all right? It was a stupid question. She said nothing. Well, nothing to me. As we walked, I heard her muttering to herself. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded like one half of an argument. I couldn't help but wonder, was she crazy, or had this place broken her? How long had she been here for? I felt like a monster. This poor woman had clearly spent some time here, and I was making her postpone her escape. But I needed a guide, and she was it. We walked in silence. I had given up trying to make small talk, and I was honestly terrified of whatever made that scream. I was trying to keep an ear out for it. It wasn't much, but it was my sole safety blanket. Like the Neverwood, it was impossible to tell the passage of time here. We climbed staircase after staircase and made many turns through the snaking halls. My feet ached, but was that from Companist, or had I just started paying attention to my many days' worth of walking through the Neverwood? Finally, we reached a large, smooth, black door.
Here.
Ellen said lowly. I looked at the door, and back to Ellen. I hugged her, a gesture she clearly hadn't had for some time, as she wiggled uncomfortably in it. And honestly, after everything, I needed a hug myself. Now get out of here. Ellen went to say something, but stopped herself. She nodded and ran back into the darkness. I was alone again, and with my hand in my pocket wrapped tightly around Marshall's recorder, I turned back to the door. Here we go. I pushed it open and was met with a vast empty room. I stood in silent confusion for a moment. Marshall! I called. No response. I turned back to call after Ellen. Perhaps she had led me to the wrong room by mistake. My blood ran cold. It was gone. A wall of smooth black stone stood where the door had been. A shot of pain fired through my head. I clutched at it. I tried to hold back the scream, but I wailed in horror. I clung to the wall tightly, almost hugging it, as if doing so would bring the door back. What was happening? Doors just don't disappear. How could it just disappear?
Ashley Campbell.
A voice boomed from behind me. Even just the sound of it was like seeing an eye person. It was unnatural. It hurt to hear. I turned and saw, well, I'm not exactly sure what. It was like a massive mass of meat, a sort of wiggling, pulsating brain sac that seemed to have attached itself to the walls and ceiling around it with some kind of membranous webbing. My heart felt as if it was burning as my eyes traced over it, but I couldn't tear myself away. What the hell was I looking at? Moving down the thing's massive form to the ground level, I finally saw something familiar, a sick, sort of uncanny familiar. Standing upright and pushing against the thing's thin membrane was the shape of a person, a woman, but she wasn't moving, but her face seemed like if it pushed just a little harder, it would rip through the membrane. It was hard to tell where her body ended and the thing began. Was she even a person, or was this just one whole thing? She seemed to be seamlessly grown into the mass. There were large, artery-like shapes that too left impressions on the membrane and seemed to grow into where the woman's mouth would have been. Finally, I tore myself away back to where the door had been. I was too scared to scream now. I just desperately clawed at the wall, praying that the exit would come back.
You're finally here.
The voice said. It seemed to speak in all emotions at once, with hundreds of voices at the same time.
Sooner than I expected. I thought you to be lost in the woods for some time.
I could barely whisper. I was breathing so hard, just on the edge of hyperventilating. I barely said.
The children call me the composer. I am the voyeur to all your misdeeds.
I couldn't make out a single tone or mood to its words. They just sounded like that. Words. I don't know where is... There were so many things whirling around in my head that I couldn't decide on what to say.
You're home now.
It said.
You'll finish growing here.
My whole body shook violently. I could barely stand. I felt my hand wiggling and saw that it was what I thought was my mosquito bite. It wiggled and writhed all on its own. I screamed again. I was growing more and more desperate. I scratched at the wall until my fingers bled.
Most people don't make it this far, but you wouldn't leave it alone. So all that was left was to lead you into the Neverwood and risk you finding me. But the risk has been removed.
I wouldn't look at it, but I knew it was referring to the lump on my hand. Why aren't I at risk? I wasn't even sure what I was asking. It felt like I was just reading lines from a script. The composer only said,
Because you're still growing.
What did that mean? What did that mean? Marshall? I said.
Is gone, and he has been for a very long time.
I thought about what the composer had said. He led me. How? I asked. I didn't say anything else, but clearly the composer knew what I meant. How many times had it had this conversation?
The
power of suggestion.
Came a familiar voice. I didn't look to see who was speaking, but I asked. Damien? There was a deep rumbling. This wasn't Damien. It was the composer.
I don't control people.
That would defeat
the point.
The voice was no longer Damien's. It had been a long time since I had heard it, but I knew Marshall's voice anywhere. But this wasn't how I wanted to hear it. It was a sick distortion.
Chatterbox.
The composer changed its voice again. It took me a moment to remember who it belonged to, but as the memory flooded back, my screams turned into weeping. No, please, not him! I begged.
You could have
turned
turned
away
at
any
time,
sweetheart. I can't make you do anything.
In
the end, you did this
to yourself.
I didn't want to say it. The words sat like a lump in my throat. Dad. I wanted so badly to see him again, to hear him again. The composer knew exactly how to make people crack, and for me, this was part of it. The sadness turned into hot, white rage. I gritted my teeth and turned to the creature. The massive, dark shape of its form towered over me. "Don't you dare touch my memories!" I hissed. "Mock my father again and I'll fucking kill you!" Now I screamed at the composer, not because of it. The creature let out a sound like laughter. The room seemed to shake. I steadied myself with an arm on the wall. Blood was now pouring from my nose and beginning to seep from my eyes, but I held my glare. I had come all this way for answers, and I was going to get them, no matter what. "The flower board," I demanded. "Did you kill all those people?" The composer wasn't intimidated. An eye person appeared in front of me, and I fell to the ground.
I have never killed anyone. That would defeat the point.
It repeated that last part. Why? Then what's the point, I asked, feeling like I had stumbled onto the right question. Finally, I could distinguish a mood, a tone in the composer. It was a sort of smarmy glee.
To watch.
I curled up on the floor with my eyes firmly shut. I looked up to see people standing over me. My head exploded in pain. I shrieked and wailed as my body seized up. As the world grew dark, I heard the all-encompassing voice say,
"And now I'll watch through you."
Finally, I passed out. When I woke, I was lying on the hard concrete of one of Companist's many halls. In fact, I was back at reception. Had the composer let me go? Ahead of me, I saw the doorway to the outside through which brilliant sunlight bled. With the last of my strength, I ran for it. Escape was so close, my mind was buzzing. Once I left this place, I could use the map to get back to Jamie's camp. From there, I could rest up enough to make the journey back to town, and after that, I would be on the first bus out of Duskbowl. I could get some authorities to come back. I could bring them back here. There was a hard crack on my face, and I fell back. I was seeing stars. I held my head. What the hell had happened? The exit was right there. It was right in front of me. I could see sunlight and the Neverwood beyond. I tentatively reached outside to feel the warm sun on my skin, but was met with cold stone. It was a wall. It wasn't real. I fell to my knees and hopelessly punched at it. Companist was the composer's playground. I was at its mercy now. Or had I been all along? I thought back to what led me to this place to start with. My predestination. I'm alone in here. I spent the last of my energy trying to find another exit. But there's nothing but this hallway now. I'm lost in this place. I want to go home, but where is that now? I don't know anymore. I left my home behind a long time ago. Where is Marshall? 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 Where is The skin over the lump on my hand has begun to split. Inside, I can see an eyeball, frantically rolling around. I want to go home.